Syria to overthrow a completely secular regime, government, and we saw how many hundreds of thousands have died. The global war on terror is ramped up and ramped down on Washington's as Washington needs new enemies or doesn't need new enemies. It's in the very in the most it's fabricated. In the very least, it's something that's created by our foreign policy.
It's the same thing from the Reagan years, the Clinton years, and really some during H.W. Bush, but especially during the Bill Clinton years, and then again during Bush and Obama. America uses these jihadi, Saudi-backed Sunni suicide bomber terrorists for American imperial ends. Our government hates their adversaries more than they hate our blood enemies who have slaughtered Americans by the thousands and American soldiers by the thousands in Iraq War II as well. This is how crazy their priorities are compared to what the American people believe they were giving them the writ to do, to protect us from these terrorist groups. And of course, Obama's support for al-Qaeda in Syria led to the rise of the Islamic State. In 2013, they conquered all of eastern Syria. In 2014, they rolled into all of western Iraq, all of Iraqi Sunnistan. And the Islamo-fascist caliphate that had been bin Laden's wildest dream from the attic he was hiding in, and had been George Bush's most phony propaganda from the era of his terror war in Iraq, had become true. Bush opened up western Iraq, and then Obama backed them to the hilt in Syria to such a degree they were able to erase the Sykes-Picot border between Syria and Iraq and declare a brand new Islamist caliphate. And they had seized a territory the size of Great Britain, which they held for 3 years before America had then, guess what, of course, had to ally with the Shia in Iraq, the Badr Brigade, the Iraqi Shiite army, and all of those Iranian-backed militias. America flew as their air force. The same guys our government wished they hadn't fought for in Iraq War II, they ended up fighting for them again in Iraq War III. And even now, our special operations forces are embedded with these, well, certainly the Iraqi army, but essentially 1 degree away from these very same Shiite militias. The ones that Donald Rumsfeld had used back in 2005 when he called it the El Salvador option. His death squads to hunt down the Sunnis. We're playing that same game right now. And so America is on both sides of this terror war all over the region. Same kind of thing is going on in Yemen. The war in Yemen is against an Iranian-backed group called the Houthis, who've taken over the capital city. And it has put the USA, with our Saudi and UAE allies, again, directly on the side of al-Qaeda, flying as their air force against their primary enemies, the Houthis. And even the AP and CNN have reported about al-Qaeda embedded with UAE forces driving American MRAP, IED-resistant vehicles, and participating in the slaughter of civilians in that war. Again, with America flying as al-Qaeda's air force against an enemy that has a friendly relationship with Iran. Not that Iran attacked us. At this point, it seems like through the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and now into the Trump governments, to see that this bait and switch continues on should mean to the American people, to any of us, libertarians or anyone else, that this government is not fit to be our security force. Our security is not its priority.
Democide is when a government kills its own people. In the 20th century, it's been estimated 256 million people killed by their own government. That's 6 times greater than the amount who died in wars.
Government and the military, the U.S. military, and other militaries around the world, but primarily we want to look at communist countries or socialist countries who killed vast numbers of their own populations. I think that's the greatest indictment against socialism and communism, is that the Soviet Union killed millions of its own people, starved them to death with famine. They did the same thing in Red China, where tens and tens of millions of their own citizens were killed off. And so government, particularly when you see where the level of government is highest, and that's in socialism and communism in particular. Cambodia is another example where a high percentage of the Khmer Rouge regime killed off millions of Cambodians. So the biggest problem in the world in terms of modern history has been communist dictators killing off their own citizens.
Numerous arguments have been used in attempts to justify the state's authority. For a time, it was the divine right of kings. More modern justifications argue the state's authority comes from the consent of its people, often referred to as the social contract.
There are basically three versions of social contract. There's like the explicit contract theory, the implicit contract theory, and the hypothetical contract theory. The explicit contract theory might sound like a straw man, but it's not. So it's the theory that some people actually literally got together and said to each other, hey, let's establish a government. Like they literally explicitly agreed with each other, either writing it down or saying it in words. That might sound like a straw man. Nobody thinks that really happened, but actually John Locke thought that happened. So he thought that with all of the cities, there was a time like when a city was first founded, there was a time when the founders got together and explicitly agreed that they were going to set up a government for their city. Okay, and then, so it was explicit for the first generation. Then according to Locke, it's only implicit for the later generations, okay, because he's not totally stupid. But the explicit contract theory, that's basically not true. So the governments that control, the land existing today, almost all of them got it by conquest or usurpation. This is discussed in David Hume's famous essay of the original contract. So conquest meaning like a bunch of people sailed from Europe over to this place that we're in now, and they just kick the shit out of the people who are living there and take the land. And that's how we have control of the land, okay? Usurpation is where, there's a government and then somebody just takes over the government by force. Like there's a military coup, they set up a new government. The hypothetical contract theory is a theory that, people would agree to set up a government. This didn't actually happen because you weren't actually given a choice and there was already a government when you were born. But if somebody asked you and if you were rational, you would have agreed to have a government, right? And then, so that makes it okay to impose a government on you. Okay, now there are some cases where a hypothetical agreement is valid. Namely, it's valid if it's impossible to actually ask the person and you have good reason to believe that they would in fact consent based upon their actual beliefs and values. So there's an accident victim who's been brought into the hospital and they're unconscious, and you need consent to operate on them, but the person's unconscious. The doctors go ahead anyway, and the argument is, almost certainly this person would consent to be operated on because almost everyone values their life, and etc. But it doesn't work if, first of all, you can ask the person and you just don't want to because you're afraid they're going to say no. Okay, so then you cannot appeal to hypothetical consent. Secondly, it doesn't work if you say, they would consent if they had different philosophical beliefs from their actual beliefs. So no, you can't do that, right? So, and that would be required for the hypothetical consent to the government. Because there are actual people, they're called anarchists, who we know would not consent. Okay, but that's not generally legitimate. So if you have a patient who they wouldn't consent to be operated on, because they've said that many times when they were conscious, you can't say, they would consent. Also, if you have the patient and they're perfectly conscious and you just don't want to ask them, that's not legitimate. You can't say, I don't want to ask the patient because I'm afraid he might say no, so I'm just going to argue that he probably would say yes, or we're just going to gas him and then do the operation. You can't do that, right? Okay, that's the situation with the government. Why is the government not they could ask us. They could, the IRS, when they send out your tax return, they could have a question on it that says, do you agree to the federal government of the United States? And then if you say no, then you could get a full refund of your taxes. I wonder why they're not doing that. And it's not because they already know everyone would agree. It's because they know too many people would not agree, and then they would have to give back the money, and they don't want to give it back.